just a little recap of where we've been. So it's actually been a couple of weeks since we were more explicitly exploring this series, but we from the start of the year we've been exploring this theme of going for refuge. So when we just saluted the shrine there, we sort of paid homage to the Buddha, to the Dharma, and the Sangha, which are the three refuges of Buddhism. So this is the central, in order to understand what we're doing at a Buddhist centre like this, what we're doing in trying to practice Buddhism, understanding what going for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha is central to that. Understanding that and then putting that into practice. So the first 3 weeks of this series, we're exploring each of these 3 refuges, exploring what it means to go for refuge to the Buddha being both this historical figure who attained enlightenment, who experienced what it's like for his mind to be completely liberated through his own efforts, and therefore it also represents the potential of any human being, the full freedom of the mind that can be experienced within a human life. So we were exploring what it meant to take the Buddha as an ideal that we personally aspire to become like. We were also exploring going for refuge to the Dharma being both the Buddha's, the truth that the Buddha realized in seeing through all limited or deluded ways of interpreting experience, in seeing through that and experiencing this liberation. The Dharma is the truth itself that he realized through that enlightenment experience. But it's also the teachings that come from that. So his teachings are an expression from that totally clear seeing back into the world that we can kind of grab hold of and follow and try and practice and put into practice, so it becomes a path that we can follow. And thirdly, the third refuge is the Sangha. So the Sangha being the community formed by those who go for refuge to the Buddha and the Dharma. So those people who, in the Buddha's lifetime, gathered around him, listened to his teachings, tried to become free like him, and made some serious headway with that, even being totally liberated as he was himself. So it's both the possibility that the Buddha's teachings can spread out and create ripples that sort of go out into society, if you like, and affect others. But it's also the possibility of an ideal kind of community, of what happens when human communication takes place on the basis of an ultimate truth. What does that do to how people can be together? So there's an ideal the ideal is not just a solitary path for our own perfection, but something that is affecting others and that we do with others. Yeah. So we've been exploring this sort of triple ideal of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So from the very earliest days in the Buddha's life, people would sort of signal their aspiration to be what we'd now call Buddhists, although they wouldn't have called themselves that at the time. They just said, to the Buddha for refuge I go, to the Dharma for refuge I go, to the Sangha for refuge I go. So what today I particularly want to explore is this idea of going for refuge in itself. So to sort of take a step back from each of the individual refuges and to look at the nature of going for refuge in itself. So we'll explore that from a few different angles and kind of look at the sort of mechanics of it a little bit. But first, before we do that, I think we'll just meditate. So we'll do the mindfulness of breathing practice. Does anybody, just a show of hands, if you're unfamiliar with the 4-stage mindfulness of breathing practice as we teach it here? Yeah, it's absolutely fine. It's quite simple. and I'll introduce the stages as we do them. So I'm going to read a few verses from the Dhammapada, very early sayings of the Buddha. Many people, out of fear, flee for refuge to sacred hills, woods, groves, trees and shrines. In reality, this is not a safe refuge. In reality, this is not the best refuge. Fleeing to such a refuge, one is not released from all suffering. He who goes for refuge to the enlightened one, to the truth, and to the spiritual community, and who sees with perfect wisdom the four Aryan truths, namely suffering, the origin of suffering, the passing beyond suffering, and the Aryan eightfold way leading to the pacification of suffering. For him, this is a safe refuge. For him, this is the best refuge. Having gone to such a refuge, one is released from all suffering. So we hear this idea of going for refuge taken in two different directions, basically. There's a going for refuge that is to that which is not a safe refuge, and there's a going for refuge to that which is a safe refuge, which is a true refuge. And here he talks about going for refuge to the enlightened one, to the truth and the spiritual community. And then spells out a little bit more about what that would look like, but that would be the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. So we've been exploring that. But first of all, he's saying that the fact is that it's not that going for refuge is something that one starts to do when one becomes a Buddhist and one starts to go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. We're going for refuge all the time. It's just the question of what it is that we go for refuge to. So here he talks about going for refuge to sacred hills, woods, groves, trees and shrines. And that's quite specific to the culture at the time. Well, one thing is that this sense of refuge and needing safety and security and refuge probably was particularly obvious at a time when there was much less in the way of medical care. If you got ill, you might just die. Where the sort of a drought could starve a population. All of these things. Life was probably a little bit more fragile, and therefore that was a little bit more obvious. This search for security, but also it's a culture in which one would sort of propitiate nature spirits in trees and in streams, and there was a sort of culture of appealing for material help and support, a bit like sort of praying to the harvest gods that the harvest will succeed and you'll be able to eat for the rest of the year, etc. So that was much more in the culture at the time. But that's not to say that this idea is something that is just culturally particular to that moment. This idea that we're going for, we're seeking refuge, we're seeking security, stability, something tangible that we can kind of put the weight of our life onto, that's fundamental, and that all of us are doing that all the time. So I'm interested in how do you respond to that idea? I'm going to suggest that we get into pairs or threes, and just talk about how you resonate with that idea. Can you see that is something that is? Can you see that as something that you do in your life, looking for refuge, and or is it something that you see you can sort of relate to what it is that's making you practice Buddhism, going for a true refuge? Do you relate in either sense? Do you relate to that or not? Either's fine. It's a discussion, and then I'll. So let's get into pairs and threes and talk about that, and then I'll hear back from a few of you. So we'll do that for a few minutes. Any responses?
One of mine has been food.
Mm-hmm.
So I always daydream about the next meal, and and then I feel like once I eat a certain amount, then I'll be all right.
Right.
And my other refuge is running, which is as a byproduct of the food as well.
Yeah, I can certainly identify with the first one. This sense of there's something, because it's interesting. It's a refuge, isn't it? It's like we all know what it's like to want to eat something, but it's when you can be really hungry and on some level think I should probably get some sustenance, and that's different. That's something completely natural. But there's something where it's like, once I've got that, if I have that cake, then the day will be it'll be on like a safer footing or something. Once I get that, I'll be really satisfied. So there's a sense that it's actually a source of some sort of stronger kind of security than it can be. Does it work?
No, I've sat watching Friends with a tub of Ben and Jerry's quite often, and it's I normally feel worse after.
Right.
That, so.
Yeah, it's easy to laugh at, isn't it? I've done very similar. Yeah, that's one of my refuges, definitely. What else? In terms of how? Yeah,
It was just that sense of, I think we both had in our different areas of reassurance and security. If I do this, then I will be secure.
Right.
It will be okay. Things will be all right. I mean, my particular one was, okay, if it's feeling a bit shaky around here, there's a lot of problems, do more work.
Right.
If I do another thing, then that's the way of, it's kind of sort of bolstering up defences somehow.
Yeah. So that would why would we need to bolster up our defences?
Well, I feel vulnerable and under some kind of pressure, or it's not exactly attack. It's always kind of a mind state of things being really challenging. So do another bit of work.
Yeah.
Which is absurd, because often really you should go to sleep.
Yeah.
I should lie down, don't do another thing, stop doing it. But instead that's too risky. It's much safer to do another bit.
So there's this fundamentally there's this state of feeling insecure.
Yeah.
And we try and remedy that by finding security. And what that will look like will be lots of different things. It might be food, it might be, as you say, just feeling like there's so much to do, so I'll just keep doing some things. And sometimes that might just be stopping us from taking a step back and thinking, what's actually going to help here? Instead, it's just this sort of this slightly neurotic sense of I'll just do another thing, and then I'll feel secure. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
We were reflecting on nature as a strange choice for a poor refuge. I don't get that.
Same.
That's it.
Yeah. I guess we need to bear in mind that this is written at a time where there wasn't really much other than nature. There weren't large industrial cities and, multiple hours a day spent on screens and so on. So I think it's probably not the metaphor that we'd be choosing if we were writing the Dhammapada fresh right now. And yes, actually, that does sound rather idyllic, doesn't it? It does sound like, and sometimes quite a creative thing to do would be to go find a nice grove or a stream, or that might be conducive to something. It might be better than what we're currently in for our mental states and so on. But I guess what it's implying is that there's this idea that there's this sort of place, or this magical kind of there's something that can sort of provide us with a certain kind of magic. Like if I go to the sacred grove and I ask for everything to be okay and for my family to be not get sick and so on, there's a sense that will sort it out, and then I can relax and not feel insecure. I guess it's noticing, can we see that same tendency in the different things that we go for refuge to. Probably they aren't sacred groves. It might be doing another thing, or just watching another episode on Netflix or something. Yeah.
Just to say one more thing,
Yeah.
because I think what just hearing when you raised your point, that actually what I was thinking about in terms of that doing that extra bit of work is it's almost like magical thinking. That if I did that one more thing or two more things, that in itself, well, it's not even doing useful work. It's like the activity itself becomes almost like kind of magical thinking.
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah.
Like the magical grove.
We discussed two different kinds of refuges, like maybe a false refuge, so what the dimensions, the nature, and I think the idea there is removing yourself from your physical reality. So going for a holiday, for instance, or even a short-term refuge would be scrolling on your phone after a difficult day. So the idea is there you are seeking comfort, you're seeking escapism, and you're losing your personhood in that sense, your identity. Because if you are, eating a bag of crisps, you're really not really yourself. You're sort of losing who you are, what you're doing. It's almost like you're blacking out and you're coming out of the experience. Like if you're watching Friends and eating ice cream, you really don't know what's really happening to you, and that's when you come out of it. Which is why it's sort of giving you instant gratification, or just you are no longer yourself in a way.
Yeah.
But somehow a more meaningful refuge would be you can seek comfort without losing your identity and not letting it sort of engulf you, just more submission that way.
Yeah, great. So this sense that a lot of what we're trying to do when we're seeking an insecure refuge is to sort of is to like short circuit this sense of feeling insecure or unsafe in some way. And one of the ways that we do that is we just sort of numb our experience. And one of the main ways we numb our experience is by just giving ourselves loads of experience, like really sweet, sugary ice cream and fast-moving images on a screen or whatever it is. We sort of overload ourselves so that we're kind of temporarily kind of taken away from what's actually going on. Yeah, good. Okay. I think this is getting. I'll just sort of say a couple more things about this general thing, and then we'll kind of go into the mechanics of what's going on in this seeking an insecure refuge. The Buddhist tradition has got a lot to sort of say about how that kind of works. So I'll say a bit more about that once we've had some tea. But I think we fundamentally, beneath this idea of seeking refuge, is this sense that we feel, on some level, the need for refuge. We feel the need for that security, and that's because we're feeling, most of the time, insecure in some way. And so, partly, we're starting by just recognising the truth of that. That is helpful, is to just recognise that most of the time, we're feeling unstable in some way. And that can be because there are things that change. We can experience this kind of insecurity in our life, and things can change. We might lose a job. We might lose a loved one. That might create a really strong sense that I want something secure that's not going to be taken away from me or undermined. We can look. We look at the news, and we see a world that's changing very fast. I think in my entire lifetime, it's always been the experience that you turn on the news and it seems like there's this constantly unfolding disaster that seems to get worse and worse. It seems particularly bad at the moment, doesn't it? But actually, I've always experienced it as being particularly bad in comparison to what was before. So there's a sense that there's this thing that just rolls on. And so if we're looking at the big perspective through that very particular lens of news media, then we experience ourselves in this very overwhelming sort of swirl of change, a lot of it very unpleasant. We can also just have a sense that there's things might be sort of okay in principle, but just this sort of deeper dissatisfaction and the fact that surely our life's meant to feel a bit more creative and a bit more of that sense of magic in a positive sense of possibility. The kind of sense you might have had as a child, where you wake up on a Saturday morning in the summer and it feels like the day's going to go on forever and absolutely anything's possible. there's something about that maybe I've just not grown up, but there's something about that just feels like there's a truth in that, and to have let go of that sense of possibility and magic and imagination and so on feels like a loss in some way. So to sort of experience life as something that's not providing that sense of creativity and meaning and so on, there's a lack there, and that's a kind of insecurity in itself. It's like, I can't quite kind of find it. It must be out there somewhere. So what we've got with all of this is the sense that and we might have noticed this in the meditation just noticing when we really pay our attention to our experience, everything in our experience that we can actually notice directly is in this constant state of flux. Yet what we do is we try and attribute a me within the middle of it, having an experience, and a kind of stable world made of things that we can understand and move around, that are not changing, that I can kind of navigate. But the problem is, it's all much more fragile than that. It's all much more fluid than that. So one of Subhuti, who's our president here at the centre, talks about the situation being that of a fragile ego surrounded by a sea of threat. So it's as though this doesn't always need to be the case. This isn't the Buddhist position, is that the world is a sea of threat. It doesn't have to be like that. But from the perspective of trying to be a me that is stable and fixed and knows what he's doing with his life, from that perspective, everything is a sea of threat because it's changing and it's threatening that, and it will gradually take it apart if you give it long enough. So from that perspective, we're in this constantly insecure place of trying to sort of tie things down. So that's where we're starting. That's the human condition. That's where we're starting from. And then there's two options. Either we go for, we will be seeking refuge. So we'll either look for it somewhere that cannot provide refuge in a meaningful way, which is what most of us doing most of the time. Or we can seek refuge in something that really can provide it. And I'll look at that kind of crossroads in a bit more detail when we come back from having some tea. So let's do that now. We can go next door and have a cup of tea. Yeah, we finished our first half talking on the chipper note of exploring how we're a fragile ego surrounded by a sea of threat. So we're now going to look a little bit at the kind of dynamic of what happens from that existential situation. This crossroads, these two options. So to begin with, we're going to look at what typically happens when we find ourselves going for refuge to something that is an insecure refuge. So hopefully you can read this. I realise that some of it probably you can't, but I'll say what it is, and you can always have a look afterwards. It's not the most attractive display, but hopefully it'll give us the main sense. So what we see here is part of what's called an Adana chain. So a series of this is in the Buddhist tradition, a series of kind of linked sort of events, if you like. I'm just going to turn this off so we got this. So what it's saying is that you have on independence on one thing, another thing comes into being. So everything is coming into and out of being dependent on the conditions arising. So you put a sperm and an egg together and you might have a life. You put if you take the temperature too high, we'll all go to sleep. If you take the temperature too low, we'll all want to put a jacket on. Whatever it is, you can apply this to any sort of different area. So we've got part of a particular chain, Adana chain here, and it's an important part. So first of all, we have contact. So this is this is sense experience of any sort. This is so because I'm a human being and I have senses, I come in contact with what I understand to be the world. there's experience that that arises. So this is just the situation that we find ourselves in. On the basis of that contact with the world, there is a feeling arises. So the word for this is Vedana. So feeling of a particular kind. So it's like there's a quality of experience that's basically pleasant or unpleasant, or sort of somewhere in between that we haven't quite been able to define yet. If we look a bit closer, we'll probably find it's pleasant or unpleasant. So basically, I walk walk into a room and there's a bad smell. Well, there's a smell, and I immediately associate that with it being bad because it gives me this sort of unpleasant feeling that comes out of that. Similarly, I walk into a room and there's seems like it smells like someone's been baking bread, and that might have a more pleasant sort of arising. So basically, what this is saying is that out of coming in contact with a world, this sort of meeting of self and world will yield feelings of things that are nice and things that are nasty, basically. So that's the sort of situation, and that's the sort of situation we find ourselves in. And we might have noticed it when we were doing the meditation before. It's like there's this swirl of different experience that's going on all the time. Some pleasant, some unpleasant. And within that is this point of sort of insecurity and change and being pulled towards one thing and pulled away from another. So there are sort of two particular ways of responding to this. This moment of this aspect of feeling is really key. The being able to experience what it's like being in contact with the world. The fact that we find something unpleasant, noticing that is really important. Noticing that we find something really pleasant, also really important, because it's what we do with that, it's what we do next, if you like, that matters. This is the point of this crossroads. So typically what we do is from feeling, we go to craving. So we basically, and this could be aversion as well. So either we're pushing something away that we find unpleasant, or we're pulling something towards us that we find pleasant. Yeah. So I walk into the room with the bad smell, and I want it to go away. I want to leave. I want someone to sort it out. I want nothing to do with it. I kind of push it away. Or I walk into the room where it smells like someone's been baking bread, and I want to find the bread. I want to find, some vegan spread and some Marmite, whatever like that. There's a sort of pull towards that experience. And so I want to sort of particularly explore this aspect of craving, and then that kind of develops into clinging and becoming, and I'll say more about that. But the word for craving that we're translating here is trishna, which means something like thirst. But it's like a thirst that we'd experience if we were walking through the desert and we hadn't had a drink for a day. And we'd feel, it's like a thirst that can feel as strong as though our life depends on getting water. We're sort of drawn towards something. We come in contact with the world, and we either want it or we don't want it. And it's got that sort of deep strength of the thirst of a sort of completely dehydrated person. And it's something that goes very, very deep. So if we were to remove craving, the Buddha tells us, if we were to completely remove this tendency to go from feeling to craving, if we were to be able to stop doing that completely, we'd be enlightened. That is the source of our suffering. It's the source of our being unenlightened. It's the fact that we do this. So that's a very deep matter. To unpick that will require a whole life or lifetimes of practice, and very, very deep and effective practice. So it's not saying that our tendency to crave is a kind of moral matter. It's not saying that we're sort of sinful for doing that, or for wanting things or not wanting things. Although sometimes it can lead us to behave in immoral ways. We really want that person, and we sort of conveniently ignore the fact that they have a partner or a husband or whatever, or we really don't want that person anywhere near us, so we're a bit rude to them, or whatever. There's it can manifest in a sort of immoral behaviour, if you like, but it's not fundamentally a moral matter. It's something deeper than that. It's something to do with our ignorance of how things are, which we're sort of born into, if you like. So I want to just explore the nature of craving a little bit more. So I've split it up into these three aspects, just to sort of dig into it a little bit more. It's so central to Buddhist practice. So often when we talk about craving, we're talking about this top aspect that I've put here, which is craving for sense experience. So kama trishna, kama, K-A-M-A, being sort of like being to do with the senses, basically. So that's when we're thinking, I want a tub of Ben and Jerry's. That's when, or I really don't want that smell, or whatever it is. It's to do with a kind of adjustment to our senses. We want stimulation, we want pleasure, etc. And that's often what it will hook onto, but it goes a bit deeper than that. So to use an example of sort of falling in love, say, as an example, we might be in this experience of feeling insecure, some sort of insecurity, some sort of sense that something's not quite right in our life or in this moment, a bit uncomfortable, and then we see somebody that we find very attractive. There's the sense experience of this beautiful form, and they smile at us or whatever. There's some sense experience in there. So we can be drawn towards that. That's what comes first, this sense experience. But it's not going to be enough. It's not like just we won't sort of pursue that. We won't develop a strong basis of craving just on the basis of that smile or that look or whatever it is. Instead, there are sort of deeper forces going on underneath that craving for sense experience that are going to sort of be fueling it more fully. So we've got here craving for existence, so bhava trishna, and craving for non-existence, so that's called vibhava trishna. So what that's saying, so we'll sort of see how this plays out, if you like, in this relationship example. So we see this attractive person, there's the sense experience that we like, but then what it might become is something like a craving for existence. So this craving for existence is a desire for something permanent. You know, where you have the sense, it's like, it's not just an attractive person who smiled at me, it's the one. It's the potential source of stability and happiness. And you get that it's very nice to fall in love, isn't it? And partly because what you're shown is this moment where it feels like eternity. It's like the sense of the boundless possibilities of this person and this relationship sort of stretch into infinity. It's like we can't see beyond it in that moment when we're in the sort of grip of that, and it can be lovely. But of course, it doesn't actually quite. If we actually follow through with it, it doesn't ever quite work like that. When we get to know the person, when it all gets a bit more real than that. But there's this moment where we feel like we've got a sort of permanent existence out of it. Do you get what I mean? So it's offering us a sort of permanence. Then we might go on. They might break up with us, say, and then we're sort of the rug's pulled from underneath our feet, and in that moment where our experience is not only feeling insecure, but it might be feeling painful. We might not want to go there. We might not want to sort of face the fact that we don't have them anymore in our life. what we might be drawn to do is to kind of numb out in the way that you're talking about. So this might be what we might be craving is Netflix and Ben and Jerry's, which is, yes, sense experience, but underneath that sense experience is a deeper craving for non-existence. This sense that we're craving to just not be there. We just don't want to have an existence. We want everything to stop. That at its extreme could be something a more suicidal tendency, but a lot of the time it's just that we just want to kind of block things out. So what this is saying is that basically craving is something that goes deeper than sex and chocolate, which might be the examples that we typically sort of use. It's not that it doesn't manifest in a desire for sex and chocolate and all these other things, but it's fueled by a desire for something permanent and eternal and lasting and the sort of ultimate source of meaning that can kind of carry us through our life. I sometimes find this if I get into a new hobby, it's like I want to buy all the books, I want to get all the things, I want to suddenly it's like the thing in my life that's going to provide that satisfaction. And, it might be a nice thing, but I don't need to, it's overdoing it in some way. So either I'm going for something permanent, or I want something that's completely ceasing and it's like permanently gone. So I'm either overemphasizing the arising of things into permanence, or I'm overemphasizing the kind of ceasing of things into a kind of negation and a sort of quietude and a getting away from things. And this is something that the Buddha was saying are two basic human tendencies. We want things to be permanently there, or we want things to just disappear completely. But we don't get that. If you actually look at our experience, anything that's arising is always on the brink of passing away again. Anything that's passing away is always on the brink of passing into some new experience, something else coming into being. So what we've got is this kind of flux state, this kind of sea. The sea is quite a good image. One wave turns into another wave, turns into another wave. We don't get permanent being, and we don't get permanent ceasing. So the Buddha talks about his teaching as being a middle way between those two things, a sort of path that doesn't over-rely on the eternal or the final ending of things. So in a way, just something to reflect on a little bit more. Because we might notice ourselves craving in our experience, but see if you can just look a bit underneath it and see what quality it has. Does it have that kind of eternal possibility quality of bhava trishna, of this craving for existence, or does it have this kind of numbing out vibhava trishna quality of trying to get away from experience? Because if we can see that, we can see some of the deeper and even quite painful forces within us that are kind of dragging us on from feeling to craving. So on the basis of these kind of strong forces, what we get, what that becomes is it gradually fills itself out. So craving develops into clinging, which one way of thinking about that would be something a bit more habitual. So our tendency to just want a particular experience becomes a whole habitual way of doing things, habitual ways of looking at the world, viewpoints that we hold and attach to and cling to. It can become a sense of ourself and who we are. We turn the micro habit of craving into something a bit more solid that we think we can hold on to. And then that develops even more into what we call here becoming, which is basically saying a life. What this is all basically saying is that by going from craving to clinging and becoming, we're building a life out of this tendency to crave. We're putting in place all the things of what we understand ourselves to be, how we understand the world to be, what we do, what we place value on, etc., out of this kind of fragile construction of putting together all these things that we think will give us something lasting or kind of numb us away from the things that we don't like. And it's if we really look at our life and some of the way we put our life together, trying to get this, trying to get career success in this particular way, trying to have an opinion that we can stand by, trying to sort of set up get the right relationship, etc., have our body look a certain way, whatever. We can see how it's fueled. It's all fueled out of that kind of craving, and we build a life out of it. And it's humbling to recognise that. It even can be quite painful to recognise that, the sort of the fragility of that, the sort of uselessness of that in a certain sense. And it's very human. That is what human life kind of habitually comes from. That's just what it is to be an unenlightened human being. It's all going to get more positive at some point, I promise. So, yeah, but not just yet. So I guess the last thing I want to say about this, if what we're doing all the time is building a life out of craving, then just noticing the particular ways in which we're doing that. And I think in the very first week of this series, back at the start of January, Sanghacharan was asking us what our false refuges were. We've heard a few already this evening. Just good to start to ask yourself, I'm not going to ask you to say them now, but good to start to ask yourself what they are, and just start to recognise them as such. There's no harm in recognising that is just what is going on here. We don't need to beat ourselves up about it. We can just recognise that that's something that we're doing. And particularly one way of looking at this that I've heard taught is that you can sort of see that there are a few particular areas in which we create this false refuge out of craving. They're sort of, we can kind of put them as polar opposites to the three jewels. So I think this is Subhuti as well, who I mentioned, our president, who kind of taught this. So it's not a deeply traditional way of looking at it, but I think it's quite helpful. So we could think of what a key one is career, and he says that he puts that as an opposite to the Buddha refuge. So the Buddha refuge is saying what we can become, what the potential of our mind is, beyond the kind of tangible, the sort of tangible stuff of the world, a kind of currently unknowable potential in our life. And the way that we can hook onto that in the wrong, or the sort of a limited refuge that we can sort of put in place of that, might be career. The sense that we're trying to sort of become something. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with trying to earn a living. We all need to do that. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with work and feeling like we're, achieving something with our energy, etc. The issue is the point at which it becomes, this is who I am. So I used to work as a theatre director. It didn't provide me much of a living actually, but I did find it. I think it's a valuable thing to be doing. I found it very satisfying when I was doing it. The problem was that there's so much of kind of making a name for yourself. So much of that, and I think this is the case in lots of different careers, is about making, like, I am this person, like I sort of stand on my name and what I've done and all of that. And there's something in that is painful in itself, because we're trying to kind of solidify ourselves and kind of market ourselves in some way. And it's this I think it's like a sort of this desire to become someone, but kind of limited in that way. Another one is one thing that we often miss when we're thinking about craving is noticing how much we're craving to views, particular ways of looking at the world that we've just inherited from the world around us, rather than really kind of, or rather than receiving them from, I guess, the Buddha himself, rather than the Dharma, a teaching that comes from from a perspective that can sort of take in the full nature of reality. Instead, we kind of what we put our trust in is something that we've just inherited. So there's lots of different ways that we can see this. One thing I particularly notice is a kind of view that Sangharakshita, the founder of our tradition, talks about in terms of pseudo-egalitarianism. So egalitarianism, the idea of egalitarianism being that there's a sort of a desire for equality, which is a very positive thing. But notice the pseudo. It's saying it's not quite that. It's sort of masquerading as that, but it's sort of taken in the wrong way. It's not a pursuit of genuine kind of equality of sort of opportunity for everyone to sort of thrive in their lives. It's the sort of the negative overshoot of that, which involves basically trying to pull everyone down so that everyone's kind of flat and everyone's on the same level. And you very occasionally sort of hear this in terms of people, like for instance, a discomfort with the idea that the Buddha is more developed than us or than others. I've once heard somebody talk about, insist on the Buddha not being more developed, but just differently developed. And it's this sense that we can't, we sort of can't sort of accept that difference, and everyone's kind of got to just be how they are, and that's fine, and you can't challenge it. And what a shame, because that removes the sense that there's a possibility of a sort of an upwards ladder of progression that we can make in our life. It sort of brings all of that down and flattens it all out. And that would be a very unhelpful sort of view. So one thing is that we might notice that we're actually attached to a view like that, that is something that we've imbibed and holds more importance to us than the teaching of the Dharma. We might particularly notice that if we kind of get a bit upset or feel a bit insecure if that's challenged. And lastly, we might notice that we are attached to romantic relationships, family, the people in our life, and are sort of looking for a kind of security from that it can't provide. Even just for the fact that, even till death do us part, death will do us part at some point. There's a finality to that, and relationships and other human relationships can't provide that deep satisfaction in a way that contributing to and being part of Sangha might, in a way that meeting other minds in the context of value fully experienced might actually satisfy that sort of longing for human contact. We limit that by picking a select group of people that are our people and expecting them to be there for us all the time and to therefore kind of provide us that ultimate satisfaction. So in a way, all of that's just a challenge to look in your life and think, where am I going for refuge? Where am I sort of building my life out of this craving for security? And how does that manifest for me? It'll be different for different people. Okay, so that's what can happen. That's what happens when we allow this feeling of being a fragile ego in a sea of threat to take us off into the direction of craving. But it doesn't have to be that way. There is an alternative, luckily. So what we see here, I put it in green, something a bit different, is that what we can have is this another link that goes into a different kind of nidana chain, a different kind of sequence that can arise instead. And what this is dukkha to shraddha. So dukkha is sometimes is described is one way of talking about this kind of insecurity that we've been talking about, this sense of things not quite working, even a strong kind of suffering, or a sort of existential, it's not quite it. That is a kind of feeling, if you like. And it's particularly a kind of incomplete or an unpleasant feeling. Rather than just responding to that by reaching for the Ben & Jerry's, what it might instead do is create this sense of a possibility of something else. So Shraddha is a sort of faith or a confidence that there is more to life than just sort of creating this fragile construction of me and the things that seem to sort of support my idea of myself. That there's more to life than that. That isn't limited in that kind of way. And we can feel a kind of pull to sort of let go the sort of the futile quality of all that into something else. And it's difficult to talk about what that is. It's difficult to, ultimately, it's something that's pulling us towards the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But it's difficult to talk about what the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are, because we don't really know what it's like for consciousness to be completely free. We don't really understand, in a full sense, the teachings that come from that. And we don't know what it's like to be an enlightened, a Sangha of enlightened beings, basically. So we're sort of drawn towards something that we don't currently quite know. But what that is something that we can trust and cultivate. So the word Shraddha comes from the meaning something like to place the heart upon. So it's this sense of there's something, the deepest point in us. We talk about the heart being the kind of, at the heart of us, right in the centre of us, that sort of deepest feelingful place. To place that upon something, what can we really place our heart upon in the full sense? What will kind of take the sort of, what will hold our heart? What will take its weight, kind of thing. We could think about about Shraddha being the response of what is ultimate in us, the sort of the heart of us, to what is ultimate in the universe. So it's all poetic language. You sort of start to get the idea. It's that yearning towards something beyond. And we need to trust and cultivate this because it's the kind of agent of change in our life. If we're going to stop just habitually going into craving, if we're going to sort of weaken that and step away from that, then we need to trust and cultivate this more kind of latent feeling of something more. So I'm going to just read a little quote by a Sangha who was, I can't remember when a Sangha was. Does anyone know when a Sangha was? He's one of the founders of the Yogacara school of Buddhism, and he defines he was quite into sort of defining all these different mental states and what's going on within them. So one of the ways he defines Shraddha, and I'll read it a couple of times. He says, Shraddha is clarity, trust, and longing for those things which have value, are real, and are possible. So I've put these three aspects down here: clarity, trust, and longing, and we'll go into those. Shraddha is clarity, trust, and longing for those things which have value, are real, and are possible. So what that's saying is that the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha are real and possible. And we can cultivate a sense of that. We can sort of start to know that for ourselves. And Vandana was evoking value very well in the tea break as well. So it's made up of clarity, trust, and longing. So the clarity is kind of a sort of feeling aspect of it, this feeling of like, yes, this is something, this is it. The I remember being on my first retreat and coming from, it was a general election day where the result wasn't what I or most people who worked in theatre, as I was doing at the time, wanted. And I'd been in a room with a bunch of theatre people that morning, and the atmosphere was really bad. We found out the results from this election. Everyone was really, really, really glum. And then later that day, I got on a minibus and went to a place called Kench Hill. So our retreat centre, Vidrasana, was being built at the time, and Kench Hill was like a sort of scout's place. I was in a bunk bed, which was about a foot too short for me, and the shrine room had just been built. Like, I think you could see the sort of the chipboard that had been sort of built, and it smelled really strongly of sawdust. But we did a simple ritual, and there was a shrine that people had made an effort to make with a Buddha image and candles and incense and flowers, and the sort of lights were sort of dimmed and people were lighting candles. And it was the first time I'd done a ritual in which we were evoking these things of real value, and I felt just a really strong aesthetic response to it. Like, I'd been somewhere in the morning that was ugly, and here I was somewhere that was beautiful, and it's sort of manifested very clearly in a sort of just a sort of aesthetic experience where my response to this value was sort of clear and feeling full, and I sort of felt devotional sort of out of that. So that's one aspect. One way Shraddha might manifest is this sort of clear, almost aesthetic sense of value. Then we got trust. So this is a kind of cognitive aspect. It's a sense that we feel that we can understand the teachings and understand the value in them. So that gives us a kind of conviction that the teachings are true and that they have something to say to us. So we might know this through a sense of we hear people talk about the Dharma, we discuss it with other people, and we have a sense that, oh yeah, this is something that makes sense to me. That makes sense to like, be generous and behave skillfully. It makes sense that I'm constantly in this sort of insecure state and reaching out for security. It all sort of makes sense. But also we can have an intuition that it's kind of pointing towards something more than itself. And at best, through practicing it, we can have a direct experience that confirms for us that it's true. And that's one of the qualities of seeing the truth more fully, and this can happen and does happen, where in that moment we just know. We're like, yeah, I can. It's not a question. It's a sort of deeper kind of knowing in the truth, the truth of it. So clarity, trust, and longing. So longing is more of a sort of volitional aspect. The sense that we're not just finding it beautiful and we sort of trust it, but we're actually moved towards it. We're sort of called into action, if you like, and that we sort of feel that we might feel a strong kind of disillusionment with the way that we're currently living our life, or the sort of the world and the sort of culture and the kind of social context that we mostly find ourselves in and what we mostly find ourselves doing. The sense of that not being good enough, in a sense, and that pull to do something better somehow. And even if the distance between us and the Buddha feels enormous, it sort of doesn't matter, because the longing pull towards it will just keep us moving, keeping us putting one foot in front of the next. So hopefully that gives you, I think it's quite helpful to split up Shraddha, so it's not just a vague sense of feeling sort of wowie in relation to the Buddha, but this sense of the different aspects of it, a kind of feelingful aspect, a kind of understanding, and a sort of pull into action. So if you can notice that in your life, it's something to really treasure. And one thing that's really important about it is that we create the conditions for that, something that we put into place. It doesn't just happen by magic. It's something that comes that sort of itself is cultivated. So a question to you, and let's get into pairs, just for a couple of minutes. Do you recognise, if you recognise any aspect of what I've just described in terms of Shraddha, what are the conditions in your life that bring that about? Whether you respond to it more emotionally or more cognitively or more volitionally, whatever it is, what are the things that give rise to it for you? So let's just talk for a couple of minutes in pairs about that. I mean, let's just hear from just a couple of people. What are the conditions? And maybe we can hear. Let's just do it a bit quick fire. So just sort of name it in a sentence, and I'll hear from a few of you. What conditions cause Shraddha to arise for you?
Putting in effort.
Putting in effort, right. So yes, the particularly an effort in terms of practice. Yeah. So there's a sort of momentum that's generated from that, and then you want to sort of make more. Yeah.
Being open to like sensation, if that makes sense. But we kind of spoke about when like let's just say for example love is kind of expected, it feels, even if it feels great, but it feels not like if for example a stranger was to show you kindness, it feels heightened because it's not necessary. That makes sense.
Right. Yes. I think so. So you're sort of being sort of open to the experience.
Yeah. To the raw sensation.
Right. Yeah. So sort of there's a general state of of openness to new experience as well, whether that's love, whether that's a sense of sort of wonder or possibility. That sort of being open rather than closed will be a part of it, definitely. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
There's like a sense in which reality is kind of awesome if you like look at it in a certain way. Like I was just saying, like if you just look at your hands, there's like it's made of cells, and each cell is like so unbelievably complex that we cannot like build one, like even with all the top scientists. And then there's like trillions of them in a body, and there's like many bodies, and they're all interacting in a way. And then when you think about reality that way, it's like wow, that's pretty amazing. But we never think about it because we're all like focused on.
Right. Yeah. So there's a quality of fascination, isn't there? And an ability. There's a fascination in life. The fact that if you look at it in a non-habitual way, or sort of any kind of non-habitual way, and suddenly it's full of surprises. And so putting on that different kind of, looking in that different way itself will kind of knock us out of all the habit. All this is just made up of habit. It's just what we're used to doing and what we're used to thinking will fulfill us. So being less habitual in terms of the way we're looking at things just throws things open and opens us up to possibility. Because it doesn't need to be a sea of threat. It can be a sea of sort of wonder and possibility as well. We're just habitually kind of resisting it. Yeah. Any more? Dora?
Maybe like space, or if we're really like overcrowding the schedule, then we don't really, like we're really in autopilot, and then we don't have time for that wonder. Both saw that like when we're on retreat, we don't have to think about these things, and all these layers are kind of getting like getting away, and then there it is, and it's like, oh, like you're in that space again, and that's always a good reminder.
So you say, as you're saying, being on retreat gives us, a big part of being on retreat is that we just create space around things. So we're not having as much input, we're not looking at our phone, we're not running from one thing to the next. That actually, what that implies is it's not a completely organic thing, that our sense of wonder and a sense of possibility in life can just open up when you stop crowding it with other stuff. Yeah,
I was thinking about courage, situations where, you know, you think, oh, no, I don't want to do that. It came to mind when you were talking about, well, this is just habit. And it does take a lot of courage sometimes to stand against one's habit, doesn't it? Just, no, I don't have to do that.
Yeah,
I could do it differently.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and like going on retreat or challenging oneself to talk in the tea break or something.
Yeah. So the moment that we, I think there's a real positive practice in making a practice of doing things that scare you, and just going again, because it's a way of going against habit and limitation. Being scared by something is just a habitual way of avoiding something. And the more we keep stepping out of that, the bigger we'll be, and the more new experiences is there. And there's a momentum of that. We can keep doing those things that open things up for us. So I guess just to finish it, like, if there's anything to take away from this, it's quite a lot, or it's a bit technical, some of this, and I've realised I've mentioned it's been a bit listy, but hopefully what it's done is just flesh out this central issue, that we're kind of constantly in our experience at this crossroads, where our experience is more full of flux and feeling and complexity and it's just more going on all the time than we're generally paying attention to. That experience of there being more going on could either be profoundly wonderful and fascinating, or it could be threatening if what we're trying to do is kind of fix it and make it secure. So in this state, which is the nature of being human, in this state, we either go off into craving and we build a life out of that. So first thing, two things I want to suggest that you take away. First thing is just notice and keep noticing the way that you're doing that. Noticing and not beating yourself up for it. Just recognizing it as a fact of being human. The fact that you're getting into craving things and feeling aversion to things, and building a life that is sort of coming out of that. Just notice the ways in which you do that, and getting to know that will just help you to sort of, in a way, you sort of see that's what's going on, and that means that you can kind of see the fact that there's something else possible. It's not kind of consuming our whole view or understanding of what our life is. If we can see that that is just a sort of strategy that we're unconsciously playing out to find security, suddenly there's the possibility of doing something else, if we can just see it. So firstly, just see if you can really see how you're doing that in your life, and that might be sort of humbling, but look at it sort of head on if you can. The second thing is to what we were just looking at just now. We know that it's possible to sort of feel drawn to something else, to the magic in life, to a much larger perspective than the kind of pettiness of having things our own way. There is a possibility of something much more beautiful and all-encompassing and not just about me. The potential of life feeling like an adventure again. But notice that will not just happen by accident. There are certain things that you will do that will give rise to that. Notice them and make a strong habit of keeping on doing those things. That is what is going to lead you towards a true refuge. That is what is going to gradually, bit by bit, and it's a training, lead us towards something that can finally satisfy this longing, this state of insecurity, this search for a refuge, a place of security, a place of meaning that we're constantly sort of struggling under as human beings. So yeah, they're the two things that I'd suggest that you do. And you might want to take a lifetime to do that. All right. Let's just finish with a couple of verses, and a few verses from the Avatamsaka Sutra, which we'll do in call and response. Going for refuge verses. I take my refuge in the Buddha.
I take my refuge in the Buddha.
And pray that with all beings
And pray that with all beings
I may understand the great way,
I may understand the great way,
whereby the Buddha seed
whereby the Buddha seed
may forever thrive.
may forever thrive.
I take my refuge in the Dharma.
I take my refuge in the Dharma.
And pray that with all beings
And pray that with all beings
I may enter deeply into the sutra treasure,
I may enter deeply into the sutra treasure,
whereby our wisdom may grow,
whereby our wisdom may grow,
as vast as the ocean.
as vast as the ocean.
I take my refuge in the Sangha,
I take my refuge in the Sangha,
and pray that with all beings
and pray that with all beings
I may reign in great multitudes,
I may reign in great multitudes,
and have nothing to check
and have nothing to check
the unimpeded progress
the unimpeded progress
of truth.
of truth.